Olá, este é mais um Clube do Livro e hoje nós vamos entrevistar um dos mais instigantes polemistas e ensaístas da Inglaterra contemporânea. O nome dele é Anthony Daniels, mas o leitor talvez o conheça melhor como Theodore Dalrymple. Mr. Daniels, thank you so much for being here. It's a pleasure.
Obrigado.
And I'd like to start off just telling my viewers that they must know you as Theodore Dalrymple, not as Anthony Daniels.
Yes.
So I start asking that. Why did you need a nom de plume, and how did you come up with Theodore Dalrymple?
Well, I was working as a doctor in a prison and a hospital, and I was writing about
in England.
In England, yes. And I was writing about what I saw. And obviously a doctor can't write directly about his patient, so I needed a bit of a disguise. And the name, we made up the name. It had to be a name of someone who didn't actually exist. And there couldn't be a real Dr. Theodore Dalrymple. And in English, this name sounds very old-fashioned and very bad-tempered.
Are you old-fashioned and bad-tempered?
Well, I leave that to you to decide.
I don't think so. But you kept the nom de plume even after you retired from
yes, because insofar as I am known at all, that is how I am known.
You know mostly as now you have you write for The Spectator and the City Journal, is it right?
Yeah, I write.
Else?
Well, I write lots of places actually. I write in Australia as well, and I don't write very often for The Spectator anymore.
Oh, don't you? Yeah.
I used to for 14 years, about 14 years. I used to write weekly for them. But really, I'm a man of principle. I write for anyone who will pay me.
That's a good principle. Now, here in Brazil, for a long time we had a left-wing, government, and we had our intellectual system was the mainstream, at least, was left-wing.
Yes.
And recently we have had sort of a diversification of that. We have new conservative writers and people of the Austrian School of Economics and so on, and people the likes of Paul Johnson or John Gray, Roger Scruton began to be read here in Brazil with interest, and they found a new readership. And of course, Theodore Dalrymple is one of the authors, of this new trend. Do you feel comfortable in that? Do you define yourself as a conservative in what sense of the word?
Well, I'm a conservative in the sense that I don't believe in utopias. I don't believe that any political system is going to make us all happy, and therefore we must be realistic. And perhaps a little pessimistic as well. Pessimists are usually much happier than optimists because they're usually right.
I agree with that.
And so I'm a conservative in that sense. I don't think conservatism is really a doctrine. It's more an attitude to life. So I don't think you can say that there are these things that you must be if you are a conservative. It's just a general attitude to life. Apart from anything else, it's the feeling that you inherit a lot from the past, and you have a duty to continue it and to pass it on. The world didn't begin with us. It is not up to us to make everything perfect according to our own first principles.
Well, someone would say that you also inherit a lot of nasty things, and you should change it.
Oh yes, I'm not against change. I mean, I'm not saying that you don't inherit nasty things, and those are the things that you try and disembarrass yourself of. You try and reduce them, but nevertheless, when you think, for example, of how we are astonishingly healthy by comparison with all other people who have lived in the history of the world. I don't think many people understand that. And I think it's important that people should understand that, because then it helps them to put their own problems into some kind of perspective. Unless
stay healthy in the light of life expectancy,
and infant mortality rate. I mean, I'm sure if you went into the street, you wouldn't know here in Brazil most people wouldn't know what the life expectancy had been in 1960, which after all is not. Well, I can remember 1960. You can't remember 1960.
I was born in 1968.
Yes, but I can remember 1960, and I think it's important to get these things into perspective.
Nice. And you just said that you just made a joke about pessimism, you know, being always right. And your latest releases here in Brazil, your latest books published here, I don't think they are their most recent books, but they are the most recent releases here in Brazil. Are that not with a bang, but with a whimper, which is a famous line from T.S. Eliot's The Hollow Man, you know, and the new Vichy syndrome, you know, which is basically about some sort of feeling of defeat in Europe.
Yes.
Am I right? Yes. So, and I remember that some reviewer in The Guardian said you are a master of declinology.
Yes.
The theory of decline.
Yes.
How do you feel about this definition of him? He didn't mean it as a compliment, by the way.
No, I know that. I wouldn't expect compliments in The Guardian, and if I had compliments in The Guardian, I would think I was doing something wrong. Yes. For me, a compliment in The Guardian would be more like an insult. But I hope I try to be a bit more balanced than that. Of course, many things are very much better. But what is disappointing is that some things which were supposed to have got better with general improvements in conditions have not improved. If we take, for example, in my country, which is a very good example of this,
England.
England, yes. One would have expected, or at some time one would have expected, a great increase in wealth to have resulted in better behaviour. But far from resulting in better behaviour, it has resulted in a lot, well, I'm not saying it's a result of, but it has occurred with a deterioration of public behaviour. So that, for example, if you look at the question of crime, it's quite clear, it's obvious, that our society is much more crime-ridden than it was when it was very much poorer. And it's much more crime-ridden, even though it is more equal.
Has the rates of murder in the UK decreased over the years?
No. And what's more, you have also to...
you have to bear in mind that you're talking to Brazil.
Yes, yes.
Much higher crime rates.
Yes, I mean, I know that our crime rate will probably seem trivial by comparison with Brazil. I know you have an enormous problem with crime. Incidentally, I've asked Brazilians what was crime like in 1950 in Brazil, and nobody is able to tell me. All they're able to tell me is it's terrible now. Now, whether it's worse than it was in 1950 or better in 1950, no one was able to say. Do you know?
I would guess it is worse, but I don't have the numbers. No, I don't know.
Yeah. Well, I think it's very important to know these things, actually. But in Britain, you can certainly say that things are very much worse. Let's take the homicide rate. The homicide rate has doubled since 1960, but you mustn't just think that it's doubled, because studies, well, there's a study in America, and I think it's probably applicable to Britain, show that if we had the same medical and surgical techniques and resuscitation techniques as we had in 1960, our murder rate would be 5 times higher than it is. So many people are saved who would have died. And that means that the homicidal attack rate, or rate of attack that is so serious that it could end in death, has actually increased by 10 rather, not by 2. And if one looks at other figures, I mean, this is a figure that I find very startling. In 1927, we had 110 street robberies in the whole country known to the police. 110. And in about 1995, we had 70,000. So, and this can't just be a difference in the way crimes are recorded. And it's not, I mean, our population hasn't increased by that ratio at all. In fact, I worked it out that the number of street robberies has increased 50 times.
Now, you said that it was not expected because, you know, we had increasing wealth.
Yes.
You know, and of course, the standard liberal idea of crime is that it's caused by poverty.
Well, this is nonsense. Obviously, it's nonsense.
So what is the cause? It's not poverty. What is the cause?
That, of course, I can tell you what it isn't. I'm not. I can't. I'm not sure I can tell you what it is. I mean, but whatever it is, it has to, I mean, and this is what people forget. It has to go through the minds of the people who commit the crime. And this is the important thing. It's their mentality. And I mean, I don't want to propose this as a scientific theory, but many criminals probably feel resentful. And they're resentful because they compare of the comparisons they make. So it's a question of the comparisons that they make that are important. Now, the other thing that many people seem to forget is that it is true, of course, that in any given society, the poor commit more crimes than the rich. I mean, that's true. But if you compare societies, it's not that there's a given, there's no clear relationship between poverty and crime. And people often seem to forget that the people who really suffer from crime are not the rich, but the poor themselves. Certainly in England, burglars don't go very far. They break into the houses of the people around them. And in the areas in which I worked, this was extremely serious for people because they lived in permanent fear of crime, and their losses were relatively much greater than mine. I mean, if my house is broken into and people steal things, of course I will be upset. I won't like it, but it's not. It doesn't destroy my life completely. But that's not so in poor areas.
Now, of course, you part of your understanding of this, what you call the mentality of criminals, comes, I expect, from your experience as a psychiatrist in
a prison.
In a prison,
and
right?
I was also an ordinary doctor.
Yeah, and you have written a lot about the underclass, you know, which is not the working class of Marxist lore.
Yeah.
What is the underclass, and why does it
well,
become such a strong theme in your work?
Actually, it's not. I don't really like the term underclass because it implies.
But it's in the subtitle of one of your books.
I know.
Yes, Life at the Bottom.
I don't want to sound. I don't want to sound like someone who doesn't take responsibility for his own actions. but the title was not of my choosing.
Okay.
Because what I don't like to say is that there is a group of people who are completely separate from the rest of society. So let us say it's 5% of the population, or whatever percentage it is, it's very bad for them and so on, but it doesn't affect the rest of society. Now, this is a false idea. What is very striking to me is that that, if you like, the cultural influence is coming from below up rather than from up down, which is a very strange thing to me. So that, for example, I mean, I no doubt this will offend very many people. But if you look at the fashion for tattooing, which now has spread very far, and I've seen it spread quite far in Brazil.
Yes.
probably not quite. It started in England, unfortunately. This is one of England's gifts to the world.
Really? I didn't know.
Yeah, yeah.
With the punk movement or whatever?
Well, yeah, and with David Beckham, I suppose. I don't know.
Okay.
But it used to be there were 2 or 3 groups who used to be tattooed. There were sailors, soldiers perhaps, and criminals. I mean, 99% of white British criminals who end up in prison are tattooed. I mean, I made a slightly silly suggestion that criminality was caused by a slow-acting virus that was introduced by the tattooing needle. And anyway, and I first noticed. I think I noticed quite early that the tattooing was ascending the social scale. People were being tattooed who would normally not have been tattooed. Well, would not have been tattooed a few years before. And at first, I interpreted this as a kind of as a desire to identify with the marginalized people and thereby show your political virtue. Here I am, I'm so sympathetic with marginalized people that I begin to act like them, my tastes are like theirs, and so on and so forth. I don't think this can be so anymore, because I don't think tattooing has quite the same connotation as it did have. But it's an example of how tastes from below seem to have ascended the social scale.
And you think it should be the other way around? I think. I mean, it would improve the life of the poor if the taste from up should go down.
I think it would. And I mean, I can say it from experience of my own family. My father was born in the slums of East London, and he was given a proper education by people who didn't think, oh, poor chap, he's poor, so he can't understand these things. His parents didn't even speak English properly, but nobody ever thought that means he can't appreciate a higher culture.
Do you think that the appreciation of higher culture is decreasing, even among the most educated?
I think our society, anyway. I don't know about. I don't know Brazil at all. Our society, which has always been a class society, has become more like a caste society. So it's actually harder for people to change, paradoxically, than formerly.
Why is that?
Well, there's been an attack on the idea of education as trying to raise people's level. So that, let me give you an example of the kind of thing that is fairly standard now. There's a book by a man called Steven Pinker. I don't know whether you've heard of him.
Yes, certainly.
It's called
I've interviewed him.
Yes, Language Instinct. And it's a good book. It's a very good book. But amongst other things, he says that teaching children a standard language, I mean, what he implies is that it's a kind of bullying of them. They don't need to be taught a standard language. So, I don't know about Portuguese, but I'm sure the Portuguese that is spoken in the favelas is not the Portuguese that you speak, I would imagine.
No.
And so, not to teach them the Portuguese that you speak, not to be able to teach them that, is actually to keep them where they are. In practice. So far from being a generous, spirited idea, it's in fact the most mean-spirited idea possible.
But this idea has spread here in Brazil too.
Yes, that it doesn't matter.
Relativism, so to speak.
Yes. Well, I think that is a terrible idea, and will reduce possibilities of social mobility and social improvement.
Well, let me ask you about, as we're talking about the underclass, who don't like the word. I wondered, by any chance, have you read Lionel Asbo, the novel by Martin Amis?
No, I haven't.
When I was reading it,
Yes.
it reminded
Yes.
me of your essays a
Yes.
lot, because
Yes.
it's the same social environment you describe in your books.
Yes.
You know, of course, your non-fiction, his fiction.
Fiction, yes.
But I think you
Yes.
should read it.
Yes,
You might enjoy it, maybe.
Yes, I'm sure I would.
What do you read actually nowadays? Because you have such a wide range of
Subjects.
interests and subjects
Yes.
in your essays and so on. You know, in one page you're discussing demography in Europe, and the next page you're discussing philosophical relativism. And I guess you didn't get all of that in medical school, did you?
No, although I think, we were quite lucky, I think, in that we spent a lot of, my friends anyway, spent a lot of time talking till 3 o'clock in the morning about these subjects, completely uselessly, of course.
No, useless talk is the best talk, isn't it?
Being a doctor, now I think being a medical student is more difficult because there's more to learn, and it's more regimented than it used to be. So we had time to talk about these things as medical students these days don't have.
But I asked you what you're reading nowadays.
Oh, what do I read nowadays? I'm reading A History of Brazil, as it happens, because I'm here.
Who wrote it?
It's French, two French authors whose name I've forgotten. One is Benassa, I think. It's quite long. It's 700 pages long, and I'm only up to page 250. So I read that, and I always read things that are connected with books that I intend to write, whether it's novels.
Do you intend to write about Brazil?
No, I probably won't. I can't write about Brazil because I don't know anything about it. Not that, of course, that would ever stop a journalist, but...
You said that there are two French authors, and you live part of the time in France.
In France, yes.
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 Your wife is French?
My
right?
wife
Yes.
is French, yeah.
And how do you compare, you're talking about the sense of decline, How do you compare France with Britain in that regard?
France has this same sense of decline, although my view is that it's 20 or 30 years behind Britain in the worst aspects of our modernity. So it's like... but it'll catch up. To take one example, the example of tattooing is a very interesting one. There was an article in Libération, which is one of their papers, a left-wing paper, and it coincided. We went to a what would you call it? A kind of fair of tattooing and there were 30,000 people there, and it was expensive to go in. It was 30 euros to go in, and people were getting tattooed from head to foot. And you can now do it in a day. That used to take a very long time. It was awful to see it, but
that's a matter of taste, is it?
It is a matter of taste, but then you could say, well, Nero liked the combination of red and green, so he had people's throats cut on grass. But that too is a matter of taste. But anyhow. One thing, there was an interesting statistic about 10 years ago, or 10 years before, I should say, there were 400 professional tattooists in the whole of France, and there are now 4,000, 10 years later. And I see this as a bad sign.
So you strongly advise our readers, do not tattoo, is that right?
I would. It's a kind
not
of...
Not even a small tattoo, discreet one.
Not even discreet, not discreet, because before long you'll want it removed. And of course, this is a form of Keynesian stimulus to the economy. First you have the, and often the people doing the tattooing will also offer you tattoo removal. So really? In a way, it's a perfect business model.
No, prior, just a little bit earlier, you said you always try to have a balanced view of things, even when it comes to decline. You know?
Yes.
And one of the things that surprised me in the new Vichy syndrome is that even though you are very critical of Islam and the political Islam and so on, you don't think it seems that you don't think it's quite as big as a problem as people paint it.
Well, yeah, sometimes I think, well, of course, I don't have a completely consistent view of this. But I certainly don't think that the majority of Muslims in Europe are fanatics, or that they are not subject to the same secularization as the rest of the population. They're behind, of course, but and so I don't. I mean, people say, well, for example, in Britain, between the two last censuses, the population of Muslims doubled, the proportion from 2.5% to 5%, which means that if it continues like that, of course, which it might not, but if it did, it would be 10% in 10 years' time. And people are very alarmed at that, but they assume that, if you like, once a Muslim, always a Muslim, and only a Muslim. And I don't think that's necessarily true. And Islamism is fundamentally a very weak intellectual strain of thought.
Do you think, really?
Weak intellectually. And
even in comparison to other religions?
Well, no, but we can see what has happened to other religions. I mean, Europe is, from the point of view of, this is different in Brazil, of course, I'm sure, but in France is an extremely irreligious country, as is Britain. So, in the United States, religion is in decline, and in any case, in the United States, religion seems very different from other forms of religion. So I think one of the things that drives Islamic extremism is actually the awareness that if they're not extreme, if they don't kill people, and so on, the whole religion will fall apart. It's a reaction to its weakness. So it's not a manifestation of strength, it's a manifestation of weakness. Now, of course, it will give a lot of trouble. You know, it's a terrible nuisance.
Yes.
You know, it's awful. But I don't think that is the main threat to us.
What is the main threat?
Well, I'm not sure what is. No, I don't think there is a main threat. I mean, people ask, well, is society going to collapse? Well, I don't think society in general doesn't just collapse. So I'm not, in that sense, I'm not that pessimistic.
And you don't think, of course, either that Europe will turn Islamic in the whole?
No, I don't think so.
So, if I may ask again about a book you might or might not have read. Have you read Michel Houellebecq's Submission?
Yes, I have.
Yes.
In fact, I wrote a review of it when it came out.
I'll look it
in
up.
The New Criterion. I wrote a long book, and that book is, if you like, it's in the tradition of 1984 or Brave New World. So it isn't a prediction in the sense of, he's not a demographer saying this is what is going to happen in what is 2022 is it's it's a kind of dystopia. But the blame, I mean, it's a much more subtle book than most people think. I mean, Houellebecq is a very talented writer. He has, I think, shall we say, only one real point to make, but it's a very good point. And one which is susceptible to a very large number of variations. And his criticism is more of French society than it is of Islam, much as he, and by extension the whole of Western society, not just France, because it's not just France. And that is from a man who said that Islam is the stupidest religion in the world.
He took a lot of heat because of that. Yes.
Yes. But fundamentally, this book is a criticism of modern life in France, without which he thinks is a country like other Western countries, without any belief in anything that transcends the here and now and the material world.
Mm-hmm. Well, Mr. Daniels, unfortunately we are coming to an end, and as a last question, I'm aware that a social critic or a cultural critic is not in the obligation of providing answers or solutions to the problems he points. But anyway, I will give you this hard question. If, as you say, no, there is some decline in European culture, how do you reverse it?
I think people should read my books.
That's a very good answer. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Esse foi mais Clube do Livro com Anthony Daniels, ou como vocês conhecem, Theodore Dalrymple. Até a próxima. Muito obrigado.